Hello, my name is Brian Dehn. This video was part of my master's project for San Jose State University and my Master's of Music Education. I hope you enjoy, and if you have comments or suggestions, I look forward to answering them. You can contact me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or email. I encourage you to read the accompanying paper first and then come to these videos. This video, the third in our set, continues with hexachords, 5-limit just intonation, and applying it to another wonderful motet. The evidence for the hexachord is all over our history books, and there's not a better example than that than the Guidonian hand. The story goes that Guido taught complete novices to sing by having them practice mutating hexachords. He would literally show them his hand, and here's a diagram of it, and you would start at one hexachord, and then when it was necessary, you simply moved to another knuckle or another finger and mutated. The system was clear and accessible to anyone, regardless of experience. The idea of the Pythagorean intervals being preferred is actually documented as early as 1300, but according to theorists in the 1800s, we see that it had already changed. Here's a quote by Helmholtz. "The proper intonation of major thirds," now he was referring to the 5-limit third, the one 22 cents lower, "was not in use until the end of the Middle Ages. It was the Pythagorean third, the one that's 8164, that prevailed until this time." We saw how the cents were different in the previous video, but here are how the ratios differ. So we can see our pitch examples, and then the Pythagorean and the third limit, and then the 5-limit. We can see how some of them are the same, but especially the E, that third, now has the ratio of 5:4. The 6th is 5:3, and then that 7th is not 243 and 128. It's now much simpler, 15:8. So you can see how the ratios were much nicer in 5-limit just intonation. We have two musical evolutions that took place during this time. First, we understood and we cherished and preferred the third. Second, and of course related, was the new ratios with 5-limit just intonation were being preferred. They are certainly cleaner, as you can see, but the issue with this tuning becomes clear once intervals are considered. A third is not a third in just intonation. I do a lot of the math in my paper, but even a short phrase of 5 notes can lead to large harmonic errors. We as directors simply have to make those choices. So as tastes, composition, and theory developed, it was abundantly clear that ratios were cleaner in just intonation, 5-limit, but frequency was cleaner in Pythagorean tuning, 3-limit just intonation. We must also understand that the concepts of sharps and flats were not the same, and harmonic reciprocity was not a thing. This is a great example, the split keyboard, which is fascinating. Or here is a fingering chart from the 17th century. It shows in no uncertain details how we thought of music and how our ears tuned. We now know the tetrachord and its logical extension, the hexachord, were the major structures behind melodic construction. I laid out Pythagoras. We have Boethius into the 6th century. And in the early part of the 18th century, it was theorized and written about quite a lot by Rameau. Now, by using this theory for music reading and performing, we can find that harmonically and practically there are drastic effects on interval relationships, and thus singing in tune when we just follow this type of just intonation. For example, take this phrase. Most have been instructed to complete the phrase with the normal full 8 diatonic scale. Now, while this may sound appropriate to 21st century ears, it just didn't exist before the 17th century. More advisable is to analyze the phrase in context of a hexachord. So first, we know there's no upper do or ti. We need to find a pivot note. So in this case, I think it's the G. And we switch then the fundamental pitch. So the result is now this. What the singer will notice is that the high C in bar 3 is now actually referenced to the G right before it in bar 3, as opposed to the initial C back in bar 1. It is now a fourth up from the new fundamental. How many times has the upper octave or the T or subsequent notes been flat in the choral rehearsal? Well, simply change hexachords and you will find your way to home easier because the reference note is closer. It is true that this example is not complete and there has certainly not been a change of key, but what has occurred is a shift of the fundamental pitch, a hexachordal mutation. This results in a smaller phrase, a smaller chunk, thus giving us a better grasp of intonation. Let us now examine the closing movement of the Baroque oratorio Jepta. This piece was written purposefully to hearken back to Ars Perfecta. The accompaniment most certainly cannot be piano. A harpsichord is most appropriate, but a lute would work as well. I've even done it with a guitar. So here's our score for Plorate. And here it is with a hexachordal mutation already done, a hexachordal analysis. What we can see is that there is no real key. Now the first chord is E major, it goes to A minor, and it moves all over the place, and it just doesn't function as a song in A minor because it's hexachordally based. So we get those concepts, but we look at for those major thirds, right? So that first one, let's take a look at the alto line. That G sharp to A, we can figure out that the hexachord is an E. But later in that bar, we have B to C, so there needs to be a shift involved. So what I like to do, especially for the first and second sopranos, is bring back that concept of the drone. And let's look at that first soprano line. So we have a G sharp, but if we have the drone, what we hear is this, right? Plorate omnes, and then we switch because we're going into new hexachord. Nes virgines, as opposed to trying to tune that in A. Plorate omnes virgines. Doesn't work, right? So we need to keep those hexachordal mutations, makes a lot more sense. Now what about page 2? I love the alto switch from 15, right, when we start the in carmine, and then doloris, right? Okay, we have la, right? In carmine doloris, and then we switch here, doloris. And then I think the most glorious change is in the next bar, where we have a G natural and the hexachord changes to a D. And of course, we look at that text, it's the first time we say lamentamini. Page 3, now we can end with these G and D hexachords, which makes way more sense than going from minor to a G major. Okay, the hexachords make much more sense once we analyze this music. Now the trick, of course, with all of this is to take those pitches, if they go up or down, compared to the piano, but they need to be based on that 5-limit just intonation, which is different than Pythagorean tuning. So the mi's are now down 14 cents, the la's are down 14 cents. Now, could you theoretically choose 3-limit? Well, sure. But no keyboard does this, and it wasn't even the ideal at the time. So again, my research tells us that it's best that we should use the system that utilizes the compositional concepts and the ear at the time. So for chant or even solo lines, the science and research bears out that 3-limit just intonation, Pythagorean tuning, is the way to go. So we need those raised thirds and raised sixes. So, save for early Renaissance and medieval music, most choral music actually, which is anything that considers the third as consonant, we have to start using 5-limit just intonation. The true beauty of just intonation occurred in the 18th century with another theorist, a Mr. Leonard Euler. He was able to combine both systems. This next video takes this to its conclusion. I'll see you then.